He spent 50 cents on a dying horse, but what that horse gave back changed an entire town. The day Eli Mercer raised his hand at that cold Wyoming auction, people thought he'd lost his mind. A man with nothing left, bidding 50 cents on a half-dead horse. But no one knew that quiet gesture would set off a story of redemption, faith, and the kind of love that doesn't just save a life. It rebuilds one. The wind in Sheridan, Wyoming, carried a bitter bite that morning, the kind that seemed to scrape through old bones and memories alike. The winter sky hung low over the livestock yard, heavy and gray, promising snow before the day was done. Rows of rusted gates clanked in the wind as men in worn jackets shifted from one boot to another, hands buried deep in their pockets. It was an auction day, but not the kind that drew crowds anymore. The cattle market had been slow all season, and the few buyers who came weren't looking for miracles. They were hunting bargains. Eli Mercer stood apart from them, collar turned up, hat pulled low. He didn't come here to buy. Not really. He had come out of habit, or maybe to remind himself what losing looked like. Once he'd been a firefighter down in Cheyenne. Strong, sure, with hands that saved lives. But the fire that took his best friend 2 years ago had burned something inside him, too. He left the city, came home to what was left of his family's ranch, and tried to rebuild something that no longer had a heartbeat. The land was tired. The fences leaned. The mortgage notices came more often than the rain. He listened without hearing as the auctioneer's voice droned through the cold air. One by one, animals were paraded through the pen. Healthy steers, sturdy mares, horses bred for speed or work. The crowd raised their hands in routine gestures. Money changed hands. Life went on. Until the man with the microphone cleared his throat, his tone faltering. "Next lot, number 52, he said. "Filly, maybe 6 months old. Owner surrender. Selling as is." The gate creaked open, and what stepped out wasn't much of a horse. She was small, smaller than a large dog, with a rough, patchy coat the color of dirty snow. Her ribs showed like the frame of an old fence, and one front leg curved awkwardly inward. She blinked against the pale light, one eye clouded with infection. The handler tugged her forward, but she barely managed a few unsteady steps before stopping. Someone near Eli muttered, "She won't last the week." Another man laughed under his breath. The auctioneer tried to keep it moving. "All right, folks, we'll start at $20. No one moved. 10? Silence. 5? The only sound was the wind rattling through the tin roof. "Come on, people," the man pleaded. $1, or she goes to the meat buyers." That was when she lifted her head. It was nothing dramatic, just a tired, instinctive motion. But for a heartbeat, her one good eye caught the light and met Eli's. In that fragile, fleeting moment, something passed between them. Maybe it was defiance. Maybe it was recognition. Or maybe, just maybe, it was two broken souls seeing a reflection of their own survival in each other. Eli didn't think. His hand rose before reason could stop it. 50 cents, he said quietly. The crowd turned to look. Some smirked, others shook their heads. The auctioneer blinked, relieved. "Sold for 50 cents to the gentleman in the back." A few chuckles rippled through the yard. Eli didn't care. He walked down from the bleachers, boots crunching over frozen dirt. The handler handed him the rope with a shrug. Up close, the filly looked even worse. She trembled beneath her matted coat, but she didn't pull away. "She got a name?" Eli asked. The man shrugged again. Not one worth remembering. Eli nodded once, then turned toward his old pickup, leading the filly behind him. The wind picked up, slicing through his jacket as he loaded her carefully into the trailer. She hesitated, then stepped inside with a quiet kind of trust that made his chest ache. By the time he shut the latch, snow had started to fall, slow at first, then thick, like the sky was trying to erase the world. Eli climbed into the truck, started the engine, and watched her through the rearview mirror. She stood still, head low, eyes half closed, as if bracing for whatever came next. He drove in silence, the heater broken, his breath fogging the windshield. Miles of white stretched out ahead, and he realized he didn't know why he'd done it. 50 cents. That was all it took to bring home another mouth to feed when he could barely afford his own supper. But every so often, when the headlights caught the trailer behind him, he saw her silhouette shift, still standing, still alive, and something small, almost forgotten, stirred inside him. Hope, maybe, or stubbornness. When he reached the ranch, the snow was knee-deep. He parked beside the barn, climbed down, and opened the trailer. The filly didn't move until he spoke softly. "Come on, little one. Easy now." She blinked at him, then stumbled forward. Her hooves clattered against the ramp as she stepped into the dim barn light. He led her to an empty stall, spread what hay he had left, and tossed an old wool blanket across her narrow back. The barn smelled of dust and old timber, the air colder than the breath between them. Eli crouched beside her, rubbing warmth into her neck with calloused hands. "You're tougher than you look," he murmured. The filly's ears twitched, her head sinking toward his shoulder. For a moment, the world outside vanished. No debt, no empty house, no ghost of fire. Just two creatures left behind by luck, finding shelter in the same silence. Outside, the storm deepened, swallowing the last light of day. Inside, the tiny horse lay down on the straw, exhaling a soft, fragile sound that felt almost like trust. Eli stayed beside her, leaning against the stall door, eyes heavy. "All right," he whispered. "We'll try and make it through the night, you and me." He didn't know if she'd still be breathing come morning, but for the first time in a long time, he cared enough to find out. The snow kept falling through the night, blanketing the Mercer ranch in silence so thick that even the wind seemed afraid to speak. When Eli woke, his breath hung white in the air. The old clock on the wall had stopped sometime before dawn, but the world outside still moved, indifferent to his timing. He pulled on his boots, their leather cracked and stiff, and stepped out into the cold. The barn was half buried under drifts, its door groaning as he forced it open. Inside, a pale shaft of light filtered through the slats, catching the dust and frost like suspended stars. Sparrow, he'd chosen the name in his sleep, a whisper between dreams, lay curled on the straw, her chest rising shallowly. For a second, he feared she'd gone still. Then her ear flicked, and that tiny movement cut through him like the first spark in a long dead fire. "Morning, little bird," he murmured. His voice was rough, like gravel under a boot. "We made it." He warmed water on the wood stove, mixed in a bit of molasses, and carried it back in an old tin bucket. Sparrow lifted her head when she smelled it, her good eye bright, but cautious. Eli crouched beside her, offering the bucket like a peace treaty. She drank slowly, trembling. The sound of her swallowing was so small, It almost disappeared beneath the wind howling through the gaps in the roof. The storm outside hadn't let up. Wyoming winters had a cruelty that never apologized. By noon, snow swept sideways across the yard, erasing fences, landmarks, the world. The ranch house stood 100 yards away, but it might as well have been a mile. He didn't bother going back. Instead, he threw more wood in the stove and stayed with her. He talked sometimes, not much, just words to fill the void, about the ranch that used to belong to his father, about the fires he used to fight down south, about the smell of smoke that still clung to him no matter how hard he scrubbed. She listened, or maybe she just rested. Either way, the sound of his voice steadied them both. As daylight faded, the wind roared louder, a freight train through the trees. The roof creaked. Somewhere outside, something metallic crashed. Maybe a gate. Maybe a part of the old windmill finally surrendering to time. Sparrow startled, eyes wide. Eli reached out and rested a hand against her neck. "Easy now," he whispered. "We're fine. Just noise." She blinked, muscles trembling, then leaned her head slightly into his palm. For the first time, she didn't flinch at his touch. That tiny surrender felt like a promise, unspoken, fragile, but real. He dragged over a bale of hay, tore it open, and made a bed beside her stall. The blanket over his shoulders was damp, but the smell of the barn, hay, dust, life, wrapped around him like a prayer. He thought about calling Maggie Holt, the local vet, but there was no signal, and he doubted she'd risk the roads in this storm anyway. It was just the two of them now, man and horse, each waiting to see if the other would last the night. Sometime after midnight, the world went white. The wind howled so fiercely that snow forced its way through the cracks in the boards. Eli lit a lantern, its glow soft and golden, the only warmth in the freezing dark. Sparrow tried to rise, legs shaking, breath sharp. He steadied her shoulder, whispering, "Don't. Rest, girl. Just rest." But she wouldn't. There was something wild and defiant in her, the same thing that had lifted her head in the auction yard. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself upright, her knees locking with a dull thud. Eli stayed crouched, watching, afraid to breathe. When she finally stood, chest heaving, snow swirling around her in ribbons of light, he felt something shift inside him. She was still alive. And that meant maybe he could be too. When morning came, the storm broke. The ranch looked like a frozen ocean, drifts smooth as waves. The sun rose weak and cold, but it painted the world in silver. Eli stepped outside, blinking against the brightness. The silence was complete now. No wind, no sound but his boots crunching through the crusted snow. He could see his own breath, thick and white, a reminder he was still here. Back inside, Sparrow stood on wobbly legs, her coat crusted with frost, but her eyes alert. She turned when he entered, ears twitching. Eli smiled despite himself. "You don't give up easy, do you?" he said. She took a hesitant step forward, head lowering until her muzzle brushed the edge of his coat. The touch was light, almost accidental, but it undid him more than any fire ever had. He closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of hay, horse, and something faintly sweet. Molasses, maybe, or hope. He whispered, "Guess we're stuck with each other now." Later that afternoon, when the phone lines came back, he called Maggie Holt. She promised to come by once the roads cleared. "You'll be fine," she told him. "Just keep her warm, small meals, and pray she wants to live. He chuckled softly. She already does. That night, he sat again in the barn, the lantern flickering on the walls. The wind was gone, replaced by a deep quiet that settled over the land like forgiveness. Sparrow shifted in her stall, hooves scuffing the straw. You know, Eli said, voice low, you might just be the best 50 cents I ever spent. Outside, the stars came out one by one, sharp as glass against the winter sky. Inside, warmth pooled in the small space between a man who'd stopped believing and a creature who never had. When the lantern burned low, he didn't leave for the house. He stayed there on the straw, near the soft sound of breathing, until dawn crept over the horizon and turned the world from gray to gold. Sparrow was standing when he woke, steady now, eyes bright, waiting. And for the first time in years, Eli Mercer felt like he was too. The storm left behind a silence so clean it almost felt sacred. Every fence post, every bare branch, every inch of the Mercer ranch lay under a perfect white shroud. Eli stood outside the barn, his breath ghosting into the morning air. The sun was low, bleeding a thin gold light across the snow. Somewhere deep inside, he felt the same fragile brightness, small, hesitant, but alive. When he pushed open the barn door, warmth greeted him, not from heat, but from life. Sparrow was standing now, weight uneven on her front leg, but steady enough to meet his eyes. Her coat still bore the roughness of neglect, yet beneath it, the faint shimmer of gray silvered under the sunbeam cutting through the slats. Well, Eli said softly, look at you. She blinked, ears flicking toward his voice, and then lowered her head, nosing at the patch of straw where he'd slept. He smiled, running a hand down her neck. You made it through again. Guess we both did. He fetched a brush, the same one his father used decades ago when the ranch still had horses worth bragging about. The wooden handle was cracked, but the bristles still held. As he brushed the caked dirt from her coat, the air filled with the scent of hay and old leather, a smell that belonged to the past, not the present. Still, he clung to it. Each stroke revealed more of her true color, a soft, smoky hue that reminded him of the ashes that used to cling to his gear after every fire. He worked in silence, until finally he murmured, Sparrow. That's what I'll call you. The word lingered in the air, gentle and sure. It didn't sound like pity. It sounded like promise. She flicked an ear, as though she recognized it. The snow outside glowed brighter. The world newly named. Later that day, he tried to fix the barn roof. The storm had torn a few panels loose, letting the cold creep in. As he hammered nails into the frozen tin, his shoulder ached with the familiar pull of the old injury he'd carried from the fire years ago. The pain was constant, sometimes dull, sometimes sharp. But it was the memories that hurt worse. He'd stopped fighting them a long time ago. When he climbed down, Sparrow was watching from her stall, that one clear eye following every motion. He wiped his hands on his coat and chuckled. You supervising now? She snorted softly, a sound almost like laughter. Eli leaned against the stall door, arms folded. You know, I used to think names didn't matter. You lose enough people, enough things, and after a while, calling something by name feels like asking to lose it too. He paused, gaze drifting to the horizon where the snow met the sky. But maybe giving something a name is how you start believing it'll stay. He didn't realize he'd spoken aloud until Sparrow stretched her neck forward, her muzzle brushing against his arm. It was the smallest gesture, but it made the air shift between them. Less cold, less empty. In the days that followed, they fell into rhythm. He'd rise before dawn, shovel the snow, feed her small portions through the morning, then mend what he could around the ranch. His phone rang occasionally, bank notices mostly. He ignored them. The world beyond the ranch felt far away, like static he no longer needed to hear. Each evening, he returned to the barn, where Sparrow waited. Her limp grew less pronounced, her appetite stronger. She even nickered when she saw him, the sound catching him off guard the first time. It was the kind of greeting that made a place feel less haunted. One afternoon, as he led her outside for a short walk, the sunlight flared bright enough to make them both blink. The snow gave way under her hooves, soft but stable. She sniffed the air, ears twitching at distant birdsong. Eli walked beside her, slow and steady. The cold bit his face, but he didn't mind. For the first time in a long while, the silence around him didn't feel like punishment. It felt like peace. They reached the fence line where the pasture opened wide, an ocean of white. He stopped there, resting his hands on the worn wood. Sparrow stood beside him, her breath rising in faint clouds. He looked down and saw how her prints dotted the snow in uneven but determined lines. With his gloved finger, he drew the name he'd given her right there in the snow, big, uneven letters that melted slightly under his warmth. Sparrow. "See that?" he said. "That's yours now." The wind carried his voice away, but she seemed to understand. Her head tilted, ears flicking toward the sound. Eli smiled, then turned to head back to the barn, leading her gently. That evening, after she was settled, he sat by the lantern with an old photo album. Most of the pictures were faded. His parents on horseback, his brother helping with the hay, the ranch before the droughts and debts. At the back was a photo from his firefighting days. 5 men in soot-streaked uniforms, arms slung around each other, smiles exhausted but proud. He traced the outline of one face, Tommy, his best friend, the one he couldn't save. The sound of hooves shifted behind him. He turned to see Sparrow watching him through the half-open stall door, her head tilted as though she sensed the weight of the photograph. "Don't look at me like that," he murmured. "Some things don't get fixed." But she didn't look away. And in that gaze, steady and forgiving, something loosened inside him. The ache didn't vanish, but it changed shape. Less sharp, less consuming. He stood, slid the album shut, and walked over to her. "Guess I'm not the only one with scars, huh?" he said, brushing her mane. "You've got a bad leg, I've got a bad heart. We'll call it even." The lantern light flickered, catching the glint in her mismatched eyes, one dark and alive, one pale and cloudy. 2 halves of something whole. That night he didn't dream of fire. He dreamed of open fields and the sound of hooves over soft earth. And when he woke, the dawn light spilling through the barn door painted everything gold. Outside, the snow had begun to melt just enough for new tracks to appear. Life, quiet, stubborn, unremarkable life, was finding its way back. And for the first time in years, Eli Mercer didn't feel like the last man left standing. He felt like someone beginning again. The thaw came slow to Wyoming that spring, reluctant as an old man rising from his chair. The snow melted in uneven patches, leaving behind veins of mud and the faint smell of earth waking up. The sky was a dull blue, cloudless but cold, and the wind carried the wet scent of distant rain. Eli stood at the fence line, watching Sparrow test her leg across the small paddock. She moved with caution, still favoring her right front leg, but there was strength returning, like a river beginning to move again under thawing ice. Every few steps she'd pause, lift her head, and glance toward him as if asking permission to go a little further. He nodded each time, and she did. He didn't notice the truck pull up until the sound of tires crunching gravel broke through his thoughts. A white pickup with mud-streaked doors stopped by the barn, and a woman stepped out, brushing wind-blown hair from her face. She wore a brown canvas jacket, faded jeans, and a pair of scuffed boots that had seen plenty of long days. "Maggie Holt," she said, voice steady but kind. "You called about a filly? Said she'd been through an auction?" Eli nodded, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Yeah. Sorry about the road. Mud's worse than snow this time of year." Maggie smiled faintly. "I've driven through worse. Where is she?" He gestured toward the paddock. Sparrow had stopped moving, head raised, curious about the stranger. Maggie's eyes softened. "Poor thing," she murmured, stepping closer. "She's small for her age." "She was half-starved when I found her," Eli said. "Found her, huh?" Maggie looked at him, eyebrow raised. He hesitated. "Bought her for 50 cents. That earned a small laugh. "Well, that's either the best deal of your life or the start of a very expensive mistake." "Could be both." Maggie crouched near the fence, studying Sparrow's stance, her gaze professional but gentle. "Legs crooked," she said after a moment. "Old break. Healed wrong. She won't run fast, won't carry weight, but—" She paused as Sparrow stepped closer, nostrils flaring at the scent of the vet's glove. "But she's got good lungs. And look at that eye. She's paying attention. That's half the battle." Eli leaned on the fence. "Think she'll make it?" Maggie looked up at him. "Depends what you mean by make it." He shrugged. "Stay alive." "Yeah," she said softly. "I think she already decided to." The screen door of the truck slammed, and a boy jumped out, Maggie's son, maybe 12, freckled, all elbows and curiosity. He clutched a thermos and a half-eaten sandwich. "Mom, you left the engine running," he called. "I know, Caleb. Bring the bag, will you?" Caleb trotted over, eyeing Sparrow with cautious fascination. "That horse's leg looks funny." Maggie gave him a look that silenced any more commentary. "Don't stare. Animals don't like pity." Caleb nodded, then approached slowly. Sparrow's ears flicked back, uncertain. He stopped, extended his hand. "Hey there, girl." His voice cracked slightly with that awkward courage kids have when facing something fragile. Sparrow lowered her head, sniffed his palm, and stood still. "That's a good sign," Maggie said quietly. Eli watched the three of them, the woman, her son, and the little horse, standing in a line against the pale sky. For the first time, the ranch didn't look so empty. Maggie straightened and turned to him. "You're doing all right by her. Keep the feed small but steady. She's malnourished, not hopeless. I'll drop by next week to check the leg." "You don't have to—" "I know, but I will." She met his eyes, the kind of look that said she was used to people refusing help and not inclined to let them. He nodded, unsure what to say. "Appreciate it." When they left, the sound of her truck faded down the dirt road, leaving behind that same wide silence. Sparrow stood watching the trail until the dust settled. Eli rested a hand on her neck. "Looks like you made a friend," he murmured. "Two, maybe." Over the next few days, Maggie did return, sometimes for the horse, sometimes for coffee, sometimes just because the long drive between towns got lonely. She had the kind of presence that didn't demand space, but quietly filled it. They talked about ordinary things, fence repairs, hay prices, the stubbornness of Wyoming winters. Caleb always came along. He'd bring old apples or carrots, sitting cross-legged outside the stall while Sparrow sniffed his pockets. The boy talked constantly, about school, about missing his dad, who'd been gone since he was 6, about how he wanted to learn to ride someday. Sparrow listened, head tilted, patient as stone. One evening, Maggie lingered after Caleb had gone to wait in the truck. The sky was streaked with pink and silver, the air cool and damp. She ran a hand over Sparrow's neck, fingers tracing the ridge of the old injury. "You know," she said, "there's something strange about her." "Strange good or strange bad?" Eli asked. "Strange alive," Maggie said simply. "Most horses that come from where she did, they don't trust again. But this one, she's watching you like you're the only thing standing between her and the dark." Eli didn't answer. He just stood there, watching the mare breathe, her flanks rising slow and steady. When Maggie finally left, he stayed behind, listening to the sound of Sparrow chewing hay. It was ordinary and rhythmic, like the ticking of a clock. He realized he hadn't minded the sound of another human voice in his barn. That startled him. Outside, night fell. Stars came out one by one, sharp and cold. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the faint smell of rain from miles away. Eli sat on the step of the barn, coffee cooling in his hands. The world was wide again, but not as empty. Somewhere out there, a woman and her boy were driving home through the dark. Somewhere behind him, a horse with a crooked leg slept easy for the first time in her life. He tilted his head back, eyes tracing the constellations his father used to name when he was a kid. The air stung, but it was the kind of sting that made him feel awake, alive. And for the first time in years, Eli Mercer didn't just believe in survival. He believed in healing. Slow, uneven, but real. Spring crept into the valley without ceremony. It didn't arrive in a rush of color or warmth, but in small, almost invisible gestures. The drip of snow melt from the barn roof, the faint green thread of grass between frozen soil, the way morning light softened instead of bit. Life was returning, cautious and quiet, as if afraid to be noticed. Eli Mercer found himself following that rhythm. The days settled into a pattern so steady it began to feel sacred. He'd rise before dawn, pour black coffee into a chipped mug, and step outside into the thin gray light. The air smelled of thawed earth and hay. The world was still cold, but not cruel. Sparrow greeted him with a low nicker each morning. Her voice had grown stronger, no longer a whisper of breath, but something real, confident. She moved better now, her limp less pronounced, her coat smoother from the constant brushing. The once frail creature had become a presence in the yard, small but sure, like a heartbeat beneath the noise of the wind. He fed her first, always, before touching his own breakfast. It wasn't duty anymore. It was instinct. There was a comfort in routine, in knowing that no matter what the world outside demanded, there was still this. Hay, water, quiet. Maggie kept her word and visited often. Sometimes she brought medicine, sometimes just conversation. Caleb tagged along every time, his school backpack bouncing as he ran to the barn. Sparrow would lift her head the moment she heard his voice. He'd chatter endlessly about his day, or the stray dog that followed him home, or how he'd named every chicken on their small property. Eli listened more than he spoke. Words felt heavier for him, like each one had to travel a long way from somewhere deep inside. But Maggie had a way of drawing them out. She'd ask questions that weren't about the horse, about the weather, the land, even about the wildfires he used to fight down south. He didn't say much, but what he did say, she never interrupted. Sometimes, when she laughed, it startled him. It had been a long time since that sound had existed naturally in his world. It wasn't loud or forced. It was soft, almost shy, like Sparrow's first steps after the storm. Evenings were his favorite. After they left, he'd sit outside the barn, coffee mug in hand, watching the horizon fade from gold to violet. Sparrow would stand nearby, ears flicking at the hum of insects and the distant cry of hawks. He talked to her then, not with the awkwardness of a man speaking to an animal, but like someone addressing a quiet friend. "You know, little bird," he said one evening, "they're fixing to foreclose this place by summer." His voice didn't carry bitterness, just truth. "But I figure we've made it through worse, haven't we?" Sparrow turned her head, the fading light catching her uneven eyes, one bright as amber, one soft and cloudy. She blinked slowly, as if in agreement. The ranch wasn't what it used to be, but there was a strange peace in its emptiness. The fences leaned, the soil was stubborn, but the air carried something gentle. Eli had stopped checking the mail every day. He'd stopped keeping track of the calendar, too. Time moved differently here, measured not by deadlines, but by small victories. Sparrow eating without coughing, Caleb laughing, the first crocus pushing through frost. One morning, Maggie arrived earlier than usual. She found Eli repairing a fence post, the sleeves of his flannel rolled to his elbows, his face lined with concentration. Sparrow grazed nearby, her head bent to the new grass. "You're out here before breakfast," Maggie said, setting down a thermos. He smiled slightly. "She's learning to walk without favoring the bad leg. I figured I'd let her test the ground." Maggie studied him for a moment, the quiet respect between them growing heavier. "You've done good work," she said softly. "Most people would have given up on her." Eli leaned against the fence. "Most people already did. That's how I got her for 50 cents. "Maybe that's how you got yourself too," she replied, her eyes kind but sharp enough to land the truth. He didn't answer. The wind moved between them, carrying the faint sound of a meadowlark. That afternoon, Caleb stayed behind while his mother drove into town for supplies. He and Sparrow played a strange game that involved a stick and a bucket. Eli watched from the porch, pretending to work on an old saddle. The boy laughed when Sparrow nudged him, then darted away only to circle back again. It was the kind of laughter that filled a place up, chased away the dust from its corners. When Maggie returned at dusk, Caleb was asleep in the hay, Sparrow standing guard beside him. The sight made her pause at the doorway. She smiled, then glanced at Eli. "You look good here," she said. He shrugged. "Good might be pushing it." "No," she said. "It fits you. This place, her, the quiet." Eli looked around at the yard, the worn fences, the fading barn, the horse breathing steady in the golden light, and realized she was right. The quiet didn't feel empty anymore. It felt earned. That night he couldn't sleep. The house felt too still, too echoing with old ghosts. He took his coffee to the barn and sat near Sparrow's stall. She stirred, blinking at him. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked. She snorted softly, then lowered her head until her muzzle brushed his sleeve. He stayed there until morning, watching the light change through the slats, feeling the world wake in slow, forgiving motion. He thought of the boys' laughter, Maggie's steady eyes, the way the land smelled when it rained. He thought of how much of life was made of quiet moments no one saw. When dawn finally broke, it did so without drama, just a slow, gray unveiling. Eli stood, stretched his stiff back, and poured a bit of feed into Sparrow's trough. "We're still here," he said quietly. "Guess that's something." Sparrow lifted her head, chewing lazily, and for a heartbeat Eli swore she smiled. He smiled back. Summer came quietly, like an apology. The snow had long melted, and the land around the Mercer Ranch had turned from white to gold. Wildflowers spread across the fields, trembling in the warm wind, and the mornings carried the smell of wet grass and pine sap. Eli woke earlier now, not from habit, but from a kind of anticipation he didn't want to name. Each day felt like a small step toward something uncertain but alive. Sparrow had changed too. Her once brittle coat now gleamed under the sunlight, gray flecked with silver, and the muscle under her skin moved with grace instead of strain. The crooked leg was still there, a reminder of her past, but it no longer defined her. When she ran, even with the uneven stride, there was a beauty in her imperfection, a rhythm that belonged only to her. That morning, Eli was repairing a gate when he heard a sharp crash from the far pasture. He turned to see two of his old cows, grizzled, stubborn beasts that had escaped through a broken fence, charging straight toward the open road. "Damn it," he muttered, grabbing his rope. He wasn't as quick as he used to be, and the distance between them closed fast. But before he could climb the fence, a flash of gray darted across the field. Sparrow. She'd slipped through the half-open paddock gate and was moving like a shadow through sunlight, fast, deliberate, alive. Eli froze. She wasn't running wild. She was working. The first cow veered left, and Sparrow was already there, head low, ears pinned forward, cutting it off with precision that seemed impossible for an untrained horse. The cow stopped, snorted, and turned, but Sparrow matched every move. When it bolted toward the fence, she swung her body in perfect rhythm, forcing it back toward the corral. Eli could hardly breathe. He'd worked with trained horses before, back when his father's ranch was still alive, but he'd never seen anything like this. No commands, no reins, just instinct and timing, the kind of skill you couldn't teach, only witness. The second cow tried to escape in the opposite direction. Sparrow pivoted sharply, nearly losing her footing, then regained balance, her injured leg trembling but holding. Within a minute, both cows were herded back near the barn. Eli stood at the gate, rope limp in his hand, awe spreading across his face. When Sparrow finally stopped, her chest heaved, her flanks glistened with sweat, and her good eye searched for him across the field. He stepped forward slowly, his voice low but steady. How did you know?" Sparrow tossed her head, blowing air through her nostrils, then walked toward him. Her gait was uneven but proud, like she'd just proven something she'd known all along. Maggie and Caleb had arrived halfway through the chaos. They'd come by for feed, but instead found a sight neither would forget. Caleb's eyes were wide. "Mom, she's like a real ranch horse." Maggie smiled, shaking her head in disbelief. No, not like one. She is one. Eli rubbed his hand over Sparrow's neck, still trying to make sense of it. She's never seen cattle work before, he said quietly. Then it's in her blood, Maggie replied. You don't teach that kind of thing. It's born. Sparrow leaned into Eli's touch, her breathing slowing. Her body trembled, but there was light in her eyes. Something fierce and certain. That evening, as the sun bled orange over the horizon, Eli sat on the porch with Maggie. Caleb played in the yard, running in circles with a stick pretending to lasso invisible cows. Sparrow grazed nearby, the golden light turning her gray coat almost silver. You know, Maggie said softly, I've seen a lot of horses. Broken ones, mean ones, sick ones. But I've never seen one like her. Eli nodded. Me neither. You should show her, Maggie continued. Let people see what she can do. He laughed quietly. Show her? Maggie, I can't even afford a new fence post, much less compete anywhere. I'm not talking about competition, she said. I'm talking about letting her story be seen. You think you're the only one out here trying to hold on? You're not. Eli looked out toward the fields, where Sparrow stood framed against the setting sun. The light caught the scar on her leg, turning it into something almost beautiful. I don't know if I'm ready for people, he said. Maggie smiled gently. You don't have to be. She already is. That night, after they left, Eli couldn't sleep. He kept replaying what he'd seen, the precision, the fire, the sheer will that lived inside that small horse. There had to be a reason for it. Maybe luck, maybe lineage, or maybe it was something simpler, resilience recognizing itself. He poured himself another cup of coffee and walked out to the barn. Sparrow stood near the door, head raised. When he stepped closer, she took a small step toward him. You're not just surviving anymore, are you? He said softly. You're showing off. She nudged his shoulder gently, as if to confirm it. He chuckled. Fine, I'll admit it. You're special. The barn filled with quiet warmth. Dust floated in the lantern light, and somewhere outside, crickets had begun their night chorus. Eli leaned against the stall, letting the stillness settle around him. I think, he whispered, we both needed to remember we're not done yet. Sparrow blinked slowly, the reflection of the lantern flickering in her mismatched eyes. For a long moment, man and horse stood together in silence, the air between them heavy with something neither could name, but both could feel. When Eli finally turned to go, he paused at the doorway and looked back. Sparrow had lowered her head again, her body relaxed, her breathing even. Outside, the moon rose full over the ranch, silvering the grass and fences, turning the broken places into soft outlines. It felt, for once, like the world was trying to give something back. And for the first time in his life, Eli Mercer thought maybe second chances weren't a miracle. They were a choice. The first storm of summer rolled over the mountains one evening, like a memory returning uninvited. Thunder cracked against the sky, and lightning flashed over the Wyoming plains, cutting brief shapes out of the darkness, the barn, the old windmill, the horse standing still in the rain. Eli Mercer sat inside, staring at the glow of a lantern that swung gently from a nail. The smell of ozone and wet dirt filled the air, sharp and familiar. And somewhere deep in his chest, something twisted. It had been nearly 3 years since the fire, yet the sound of thunder still carried the same pitch as breaking timber. Every flash of light was another hallway collapsing, another scream swallowed by smoke. He could still see it when he closed his eyes. The red heat, the choking black, the moment his friend Tommy disappeared behind a wall of flames and never came back. Eli had carried that moment like a scar he couldn't show. Quiet, but constant. The rain outside thickened, tapping hard against the tin roof. Sparrow shifted in her stall, restless, ears flicking at each crack of thunder. Eli stood, poured a handful of oats into her bucket, and spoke softly. "Easy, girl. It's just noise. Nothing's burning." But even as he said it, the smell of wet ash drifted through his mind, and he wasn't sure if he was lying to her or to himself. A flash of lightning lit the barn white, and for an instant he saw her clearly. The curve of her neck, the glint in her mismatched eyes. One dark, one pale. She looked right at him, unflinching. The storm trembled in her body, but there was something steady, too. Something that reminded him of a heartbeat he'd forgotten he had. He leaned his forehead against the stall door, whispering, "I couldn't save him, you know. I tried." Sparrow didn't move. She just breathed, slow and even. The lantern's light flickered, and the sound of rain filled the space between them. When the storm passed, Eli didn't sleep. He saddled Sparrow for the first time since buying her. She'd healed enough to carry lightweight, and he needed the ride, the rhythm of motion to quiet the ghosts in his head. He didn't go far, just along the fence line, through grass heavy with rain, the moon breaking through clouds above. Sparrow's gait was uneven, but her stride was sure. Each step was a whisper through the wet earth, the smell of sage rising from under her hooves. Eli breathed it in, feeling the night press close, but not suffocating. For once, the dark didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like a witness. Halfway through the ride, he stopped near the old windmill. The metal blades creaked in the wind, their rhythm oddly human. He dismounted and stood beside her, hand on her neck. "You ever lose someone?" he said quietly, almost laughing at himself. "No, I guess not. But maybe you know what it's like to live after losing." Sparrow turned her head, muzzle brushing against his sleeve, warm breath cutting through the chill. Eli looked up at the stars beginning to show through the thinning clouds. The sky was clear again, but the smell of smoke lingered in memory, as real as the ground under his boots. When dawn came, he found himself sitting in the field, Sparrow grazing a few feet away. He'd been there for hours, the sun slowly climbing over the ridge, painting the land gold. He realized he hadn't thought about the fire for the last 30 minutes. It was still there, somewhere in the distance of his mind, but not sitting on his chest. It had loosened its hold, even if just a little. Later that morning, Maggie stopped by with coffee and fresh bread. Caleb ran straight to Sparrow, laughing when the mare nickered in greeting. Maggie handed Eli a cup, steam curling between them. "You look like you haven't slept," she said. "Didn't," he admitted. "Rode out after the storm." She studied him quietly. "You ride often?" "Not since—" He trailed off. "Not since before." "Before what?" He hesitated, then sighed. "Before everything burned." Maggie nodded slowly. "I figured it was something like that." They didn't talk for a while. The sound of Caleb's laughter filled the space. Sparrow stood patient as the boy brushed her mane, the sunlight glinting off the strands like silver thread. Finally, Maggie said, "You know, I don't think we get rid of ghosts like that. We just learn to live beside them." Eli glanced at her, then at Sparrow. "She's better at it than I am." "She's had to be," Maggie replied. "Horses remember pain, but they don't live in it. They move forward because that's what keeps them alive. The words lingered long after she left. That night, Eli walked the pasture again. The stars stretched wide across the dark sky. Sparrow followed behind him without a lead, her hoofbeats soft against the dirt. He stopped by the fence, looking toward the distant hills. "You know," he said, "I think maybe that's what we're doing too. Learning to live beside it." Sparrow stepped closer, resting her head against his shoulder. He didn't move. The quiet was complete, but not empty. Somewhere in that stillness, Eli felt the smallest flicker of forgiveness. Toward the fire, toward the years he'd lost, and finally, toward himself. For a long moment, man and horse stood side by side, breathing the same cool air, watching the horizon fade into night. When he finally turned to go, the windmill creaked behind them again, the sound low and steady, like a heartbeat. He smiled faintly. "Come on, girl," he said. "Let's go home." The wind came down from the Bighorn Mountains like a living thing, cold, sharp, full of warning. It whipped through the grass, rattling the tin roof and carrying the smell of snow that didn't belong to summer. By afternoon, the horizon had turned a strange shade of gray, the color of old bruises. Eli Mercer knew what that meant. He'd lived in Wyoming long enough to recognize the breath before a blizzard. He stood on the porch, mug in hand, eyes narrowing as the sky folded in on itself. Sparrow grazed quietly by the fence, unaware or unbothered. Maggie had gone into town for supplies, and Caleb had stayed to help Eli mend the southern fence line, a task that had stretched longer than it should have. The boy was good-hearted, but distracted, forever wandering off to chase grasshoppers or collect smooth stones he thought looked like animals. "Caleb," Eli called, scanning the field. "We've got to wrap it up. Weather's turning." The only reply was the echo of his own voice. A gust of wind shoved through the yard, scattering loose hay and slamming the barn door against its hinges. Sparrow lifted her head sharply, nostrils flaring, ears pinned. Eli's stomach tightened. He dropped the mug and started toward the pasture. "Caleb!" he shouted again. No answer. Lightning flickered somewhere over the ridge, a jagged white vein across the sky. Then came the thunder, low, rolling, like something vast moving beneath the earth. The temperature dropped so fast his breath turned white. He ran now, boots cutting into the mud. The fence line stretched empty before him, the wire trembling in the wind. He followed it, calling again, heart hammering against his ribs. When he reached the far gate, he found Caleb's glove caught in the barbed wire, torn but fresh. The prints in the dirt led toward the creek bed, and beyond it, the dark mouth of the hills. "Damn it," Eli muttered, scanning the ridge. The boy must have gone after the stray calf that had broken through earlier that day. First flakes of snow fell. A few at first, then hundreds, swirling in angry circles. Within minutes, the world turned white. Visibility dropped to yards. The air howled through the canyons, carrying bits of ice that stung his face. Sparrow's whinny cut through the storm like a warning bell. When Eli turned, she was there at the edge of the corral, stamping and tossing her head, breath bursting in white plumes. He grabbed the old saddle, but she moved before he could finish tightening it, sidestepping, impatient. "Easy, girl," he said, but she wasn't frightened. She was waiting. Lightning split the sky again, and in that brief flash, Eli saw what she saw, a dark blur moving near the tree line. Caleb. Without another thought, Eli swung into the saddle. The wind tore at him, and the snow stung his eyes, but Sparrow pushed forward into it, hooves cutting through the drifts like oars through rough water. She didn't hesitate. Even with her crooked leg, she moved as if the storm itself was a challenge she'd been born to face. The world shrank to white and sound, the roar of wind, the rhythm of Sparrow's strides, Eli's breath coming in ragged bursts. He leaned low, guiding her toward the hills. "Come on, girl. Find him." Sparrow's ears flicked, catching something Eli couldn't hear. She veered left, following an invisible trail. Minutes stretched into forever. Then, through the swirling white, Eli saw a dark shape under a pine, small, still. He shouted Caleb's name, dismounted, and stumbled through the snow. The boy lay curled against the tree, shivering, half-conscious. Eli dropped to his knees, pulling the child into his arms. "Got you," he said, voice shaking. "You're all right now. You hear me?" Caleb's lips moved. Barely a whisper. I couldn't find the calf." Eli almost laughed, almost cried. "Forget the damn calf." Sparrow stood nearby, head high, body trembling from exertion. Her mane was caked with snow, and her sides heaved, but she stayed alert, ears flicking toward home. When Eli tried to stand, his legs nearly gave out. The cold was cutting deep now, turning thought into fog. "Can't see the trail," he muttered. The snow was too thick. The horizon had vanished. Then Sparrow stepped forward, bumping his shoulder with her muzzle, then turned slightly, looking back at him. A gesture simple, but certain. "You want to lead?" he said hoarsely. She snorted and started walking into the storm, slow but steady. Eli lifted Caleb onto the saddle, then climbed up behind, wrapping his arms around the boy and clutching the reins loosely. Sparrow moved without hesitation, her hooves finding footing where there should have been none, her head low against the wind. The world blurred into white noise and movement. Eli lost track of direction, of time, of everything but the warmth of the boy pressed against him and the steady rhythm beneath them. He whispered words he couldn't hear over the storm. Please, prayers, promises. When the wind finally broke, they were back at the ranch. The barn loomed through the haze like a dream, its lantern still burning from earlier. Sparrow stumbled once, nearly falling, but pushed on until they reached the gate. Eli slid off, half carrying Caleb inside. Maggie's truck skidded into the yard moments later, tires throwing mud and snow. She ran toward them, face pale, eyes wide. "Oh my God, what happened?" Eli didn't answer. He just handed her the boy and whispered, "He's safe." Behind them, Sparrow stood in the doorway, sides heaving, eyes glassy but alert. Maggie looked at the mare, then back at Eli. "She brought you home?" He nodded slowly, still catching his breath. "She didn't just bring us home. She saved us." The snow kept falling through the night, soft now, gentle. Maggie stayed until Caleb's breathing evened out. She found Eli sitting beside Sparrow in the barn, brushing the ice from her mane. The mare was exhausted, her body trembling, but her eyes were calm. "You'll kill her if you ride her like that again," Maggie said quietly. "I won't," Eli replied. "I don't think I'd survive losing her." Maggie knelt beside him, touching Sparrow's neck. "She's tougher than she looks." "So was I once," he said, voice soft. "She reminded me how." For a long time, they sat in silence, listening to the snow whisper against the roof. When Sparrow finally lowered her head to rest, Eli covered her with a blanket and stayed there until her breathing grew slow and even. Outside, the storm faded into memory. Inside, a man, a woman, a boy, and a horse breathed in the same rhythm, the fragile, miraculous sound of those who had almost been lost and had somehow found their way back. The following spring arrived gentle as a breath, the kind that bends grass without breaking it. The valley thawed under sunlight that felt new again, softer, almost forgiving. What the storm had taken, the earth now returned, slowly, humbly, in color and sound. Calves bawled in the pasture. The creek sang louder with melted snow, and somewhere high above, the first meadowlark of the season trilled its bright, defiant song. The Mercer Ranch looked different now, though it hadn't gained much in wealth. Fences had been rebuilt, the barn roof mended, the fields reseeded. Yet what made the place feel new wasn't the paint or the repairs. It was the people and the horse that filled its quiet with purpose. Eli stood by the gate, coffee steaming in his hands. Caleb was helping Maggie carry hay to the barn, both laughing as Sparrow followed close behind, her nose bumping their shoulders impatiently. The boy had grown since the storm, his step surer, his voice stronger. He called Sparrow the Snow Angel, though Eli never said aloud how true that felt. After that night, something had shifted in all of them. The ranch that once stood as a monument to loss had turned into something else, a place where things got a second chance. It began simply, almost accidentally. Maggie had been treating a few rescue horses from nearby towns, animals abandoned after the harsh winter. Eli offered space in one of his old corrals. "Just until they find homes," he'd said. But homes didn't come easily, so they stayed. Then came the kids. Quiet ones, angry ones, the kind that had already learned too young that life could turn cold. Maggie volunteered with a small community program for at-risk youth, and one weekend she brought a girl named Lena to help muck stalls. Lena didn't speak the entire day, but when Sparrow brushed her arm with that soft, gray muzzle, she whispered something back that made Maggie's throat tighten. It spread from there, word of mouth, one soul to another. Within months, the Mercer Ranch had turned into something unexpected, a place where broken things learned how to breathe again. They called it the Sanctuary, though Eli never remembered agreeing to the name. It just fit. The days followed an easy rhythm. Mornings were full of noise, hooves, laughter, the bark of Maggie's new rescue dog. Afternoons quieted into the soft rustle of hay, the sound of a brush against Sparrow's coat, the murmur of young voices finding steadiness. Evenings were still Eli's favorite, when the land glowed gold and the fences stretched long shadows toward the horizon. He had stopped checking his bank balance. The bills still came, but people started to help. Neighbors donating feed, small local sponsors offering supplies. Even a regional news blog ran a story about the firefighter who turned a dying ranch into a refuge. He didn't care much about headlines, but Maggie said it helped, and she was usually right. Sometimes, when tourists or donors came to visit, they'd ask which horse had started it all. Maggie would smile and point toward the small gray mare grazing near the fence line. "Her name's Sparrow," she'd say. "She was bought for 50 cents. They'd laugh, thinking it was a metaphor. But Eli knew better. He still had the original auction slip, yellowed and creased, pinned on the barn wall beside a photo of Caleb and Sparrow from that first summer. That evening, he sat on the porch, the sky a watercolor of rose and violet. Maggie joined him, a glass of sweet tea in her hand. Caleb and Sparrow were down by the stream, the boy skipping stones while the mare watched from the bank, her ears twitching to every splash. "Hard to believe it's been 2 years," Maggie said. Eli nodded. "Feels longer. Feels like a whole other life." She smiled, watching the boy. "You did good, Eli." He shook his head. "No, she did good. Sparrow did. I just followed her lead." "Maybe that's the same thing." The air was warm enough that the scent of lilacs drifted from the garden. Fireflies blinked near the fence, and the world felt, if only for that moment, without edges. Maggie turned toward him. "You ever think about how it all started? 50 cents at a dying auction?" "Every day." He looked out toward the field, where the light caught Sparrow's silver mane. "Sometimes I think I didn't save her at all. She saved everything else." As twilight deepened, Caleb and Sparrow came up the hill together. The boys' laughter carried ahead of them, pure and bright. Sparrow followed close, her limp now barely noticeable, her eyes soft with trust. When they reached the porch, Caleb leaned against her shoulder. "She still follows me everywhere," he said proudly. Eli chuckled. "She's keeping an eye on you." "Maybe I'm keeping an eye on her," Caleb replied, and Maggie ruffled his hair. Later, when the lamps inside were dimmed and the night turned cool, Eli walked back to the barn alone. The moon hung low, silvering the pasture. He found Sparrow in her stall, half asleep, and leaned on the door. "Hey, girl," he said quietly. She lifted her head, blinking. The years had softened her, but hadn't dulled her spirit. Her eyes, the one bright, the other clouded, still saw more than most. "You've done good," he whispered. "Better than me." He reached up and stroked her neck. The rhythm of her breathing matched his, steady and sure. "You know," he said softly, "you turned this place into something worth keeping. A home, not just a roof." Sparrow pressed her head gently against his chest. He closed his eyes, letting the weight of that simple contact wash through him. Outside, the world was utterly still, save for the quiet hum of crickets and the distant rush of the creek. For the first time since the fire, since the losses, since that frozen night at the auction, Eli Mercer felt whole. He stayed there until Sparrow drifted back to sleep, her breath slow, her body warm against the cool air. Then he stepped out, closing the stall gently behind him. The stars stretched across the Wyoming sky, countless and calm. The ranch lay beneath them, alive again, every scar turned into something that could hold light. 6 years had passed since the day Eli Mercer raised his hand in that cold auction yard. The memory had grown softer around the edges, worn smooth by time, but it still returned to him sometimes. How the wind bit at his cheeks, how everyone laughed when he said 50 cents, how the tiny gray filly had lifted her head as if daring the world to see her. He still kept the auction slip in his wallet, folded twice over. The ink faded, but legible. It reminded him that value isn't written in price tags. It's written in choices. The sanctuary had grown far beyond what he'd imagined. What started as a few rescue horses and a handful of troubled kids had become a community. Local schools sent students to volunteer. Ranchers brought abandoned livestock instead of selling them for slaughter. Even the town's sheriff dropped by some evenings to drink coffee and help mend fences. There were new barns now, bright red with white trim and solar lights along the paths. A small wooden sign stood at the entrance, Mercer Sanctuary, where second chances begin. Maggie had painted it herself, and the way she smiled when she brushed the last stroke told Eli she wasn't painting wood. She was painting gratitude. He and Maggie never spoke much about labels. They didn't need to. She'd moved her veterinary practice closer, and her laughter had become part of the ranch's soundtrack. Caleb, now almost 18, had grown taller than Eli. He worked full-time on weekends, helping the younger kids learn how to handle the gentler horses. He had the same easy confidence Sparrow had taught all of them. Quiet, patient, grounded. Sparrow, though older, was still the heart of the place. Her coat had turned the color of morning fog, her steps slower but deliberate. Every new rescue seemed to find comfort in her presence. When frightened horses arrived trembling and thin, Sparrow was the first to approach, nose pressed against their necks as if to say, "You're safe now." That summer, a reporter from a national magazine came to write a story about the ranch. She was polite and curious, taking photographs of the children brushing the horses, of Maggie and Eli talking by the paddock, of Sparrow standing near the fence with her head tilted into the breeze. "What do you think started it all?" the reporter asked, notebook poised. Eli smiled. 50 cents, he said simply. She laughed, thinking it a joke, but he didn't correct her. That evening, after the crew left, the ranch grew quiet again. The sun sank low over the hills, turning the fields gold. Eli walked out toward the pasture, his shadow stretching long beside him. Sparrow was there, grazing under the cottonwoods, her mane catching the last light. He stopped beside her, hand resting on her neck. Her skin was warm beneath his palm, her breathing slow. "Still here, huh?" he murmured. "Still teaching me things." She turned her head slightly, brushing his chest with her muzzle. Her touch was feather-light but sure, the same way she had done since that first winter. He felt the familiar catch in his throat, the one that came when words couldn't reach where gratitude lived. He sat down on the grass, the air thick with the scent of clover and dust. "You remember that night, don't you?" he said softly. "The snow, the storm, the way everyone thought I'd lost my mind." He chuckled. "Maybe I had, but it's funny. Sometimes losing your mind is the only way to find your heart again." The breeze moved through the field, carrying the soft rustle of grass. Behind him, he could hear laughter from the barn, Maggie's voice mingling with the kids. Life, steady and alive. When twilight deepened, he stood and looked across the land. The fences gleamed faintly in the fading light, stretching toward the mountains like lines of memory. This place, once on the edge of ruin, was alive because of a choice that hadn't made sense to anyone but him. He looked back at Sparrow. "You didn't just save the ranch, you know," he said. "You saved me from forgetting what mercy feels like." Her tail flicked lazily, eyes half closed, content. Later, as the first stars appeared, Maggie came to find him. She leaned against the fence beside him, her hands tucked into her jacket. "Caleb wants to name the new colt after her," she said. Eli smiled. "Sparrow Jr.? Doesn't quite have the same ring." She laughed, soft and low. "No, he wants to call her Hope." Eli nodded. "Fitting." They stood together in silence, watching the gray mare move through the field. The world had gone blue with evening, every sound distant and gentle. "You ever think about how different things could have been?" Maggie asked quietly. Sometimes, he said. But then I remember, if even one other person had raised their hand that day, none of this would exist. She looked at him, eyes reflecting the last light. That's what faith looks like, Eli. He shook his head. No, that's what grace looks like. The wind carried her laughter, mingling with the murmur of horses in the distance. For a long time, neither spoke. The silence between them was comfortable now, full of things that didn't need saying. When they finally turned to head back to the house, Sparrow followed a few steps behind, hooves soft against the grass. She stopped at the fence line, watching them go. Eli turned back once more, raising his hand in a small wave. "Best 50 cents I ever spent," he called. Sparrow lifted her head, eyes catching the starlight, and gave a low, gentle nicker that rolled through the air like a promise. The next morning, the world woke quiet and new again. Sunlight poured across the hills, touching every scar, every fence post, every blade of grass the color of honey. Children's voices rose from the paddock. Caleb's laughter echoed through the valley. Maggie stood by the porch with coffee, and Eli walked out to join her, the two of them watching Sparrow move slowly through the pasture, her shape framed against the rising sun. Life had never been perfect, but it was whole. And for a man who once thought he'd lost everything, that was more than enough. Eli took a slow breath, letting the morning fill his lungs. "We made it," he whispered. The wind carried his words across the open field, over the fences, beyond the ranch, into a world that always needed reminders that broken things could still shine. And somewhere, standing in the golden light, Sparrow turned her head as if she'd heard him. She exhaled softly, a sound that seemed almost like agreement. If this story touched you, tell us what you felt when Eli lifted his hand and chose that little horse. Leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us for more true stories of second chances, quiet courage, and the kind of love that still moves the world.